man came up to me and he said, David, I'm going to tell you something, and it's not a compliment, and I don't want you to take it as a compliment. And I said to him, well, bad news. I said, I'm almost certain I am now going to take it as a compliment. I said, go ahead. He said, David, if you'd been my vicar at school, I'd probably still be a Christian. I don't want to be a Christian. I hate Christians. I hate Christianity. And he said, you are a very, very dangerous man because you made it sound attractive and reasonable.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Great to be back for another week. If you're new to us, Inspired is all about meeting different people from across the globe, different walks of life, who are all following Jesus, using their gifts for his glory, and hopefully it leaves you encouraged and stirred and challenged in your own faith journeys. We are relentlessly bombarded by negativity and bad news, and the whole point of Inspired is to counteract all that. And I'm excited this week because we've got with us David Robertson. Welcome, David.
Yeah, glad to be with you, and glad that you want to be positive. I will bring you a suitable dose of Scots negativity.
Oh, brilliant. Bring it on. So you are Scottish, but you're in Sydney right now. You've been there for a while. In terms of our connection, I'm friends with Andy Bannister and Aaron Edwards. I just did a podcast with him a short time ago, and he put me in touch. The Flea is your website and podcast. You're the founder of Solas, which is all about persuasively communicating Christ in today's culture. So you were ministering in Robert Murray McShane's church in Dundee in Scotland before moving to Australia. There's loads I want to unpack, David, but just give us a bit of context and background.
Well, you can unpack whatever bit of this you wish, but I was born, dare I say it, I was actually born in England, in Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is technically English. But my parents assure me I was conceived in Scotland. I was brought up for a short while in the Scottish borders. Then I actually moved down to Gloucestershire. My father was a farm worker, and we were there until I was about age 9. And we went to the Scottish Highlands, to Easter Ross, where I grew up, went to school and so on. Then went to the University of Edinburgh to study history and politics. I had become a Christian just before I left school. And my aim was to go into politics, to be honest. But when I finished university, a number of things happened, and I ended up studying at the Free Church College. That's the Free Church of Scotland College, now known as Edinburgh Theological Seminary, for 4 years, and for 3 years rather. And then I was called as the youngest Free Church minister, age 24, to the Highland village of Brora for 6 years. I was then called to Dundee we were there for 27 years to a church that had 7 people when we went to it, and when we left it had about 250, which was lovely. And then for the past 4 years I've been working in Sydney, for 2 years with an organization called City Bible Forum, and for 2 years with Sydney Anglicans, and I'm about to return to my Presbyterian roots. Basically, I do a lot of media stuff and things like that as well, and I've written a few books, and so that's it in summary. I'm married. I've got 3 children and 5 grandchildren.
Great, excellent. Well, I love the story of your healing testimony, and you were doing an apologetics debate. Were you with someone, and didn't the guy on the opposite side say, I don't believe in healing, that there can't be a God?
Yeah, I was. I'd been seriously ill. I mean, I wasn't supposed to live, actually. And the kind of old joke is that my wife was told if he lives, basically he'll be severely brain damaged. And of course, people keep saying, well, how do you know he's not? And maybe that explains things. But so if I can just simply say this, I was very active in the church, obviously, but also in other things. The former leader of the SNP, Gordon Wilson, had started coming to our church, he and his wife, and professed faith and so on. And it was the time of the same-sex marriage debate in Scotland, and he and I produced a paper which asking for a referendum, which was headline news on all the papers. And there was an enormous pushback, as you can imagine, and a lot of stress and stuff. And I woke up on a Wednesday, not feeling all that well, went to the doctor. I actually collapsed in the middle of the night, went to the doctor the next day. They thought it was my heart, so they pumped me with aspirin, which is the worst thing they could have done because I had an internal bleed. And as a result, the aspirin, of course, makes you bleed more. And I did a wedding on the Friday, and I felt terrible. I had cold sweat, and I thought, So I said to my wife, I don't think that I'm going to make it to the reception. I'm not feeling great. Can you just take me home? And we went to the local hospital to pick up one of our doctors to go to the reception, and I asked her to take me home. And then this probably saved my life. My son said, I've left my phone, Dad. Can we go back to the church? So I went back to the church, and I said to my wife, I just don't feel too good. I got up out the car, collapsed, literally in a pool of blood. I started throwing up blood clots and everything. Taken to the hospital. Horrible word. I hate the word endoscopies. Had lots of endoscopies. It turned out that I had the Heliobacter virus, which had caused 2 massive ulcers, which had burst, which is not really much of a problem, except they burst over main blood arteries. As a result, to cut a long story short, I lost 28 pints of blood since you've only got 8. Yeah. They kept pumping me with blood product, and I drowned in my own blood. My lungs stopped working. I got E. coli of the lung. They didn't know what to do with me. They didn't think I was going to live. I went into a coma, came in and out of a coma quite a lot. I was in ICU for about, I think, 6 weeks, and then high dependency for a couple of weeks, and then a main ward and so on. And there's much that happened during that time. My family, it was really tough. My daughter was in Australia, and somebody flew her back because I was going to die. Probably one of the most significant things is when I got out of hospital, they showed me a Facebook message my son had sent, which said, been to see my dad today with my sister, picked her up from the airport, probably for the last time. If my dad lives, that's an answer to prayer. And if he dies, that's an answer to prayer, because my dad's greatest problem, his sin, has already been dealt with. And I just thought, wow. I mean, people must have read that, and non-Christians would have no comprehension of that. What did this guy do? Was he a murderer? Was he, And then, I wasn't getting better. Each weekend, my wife was told it's 50-50 whether he'll live. And then for some reason, and the Free Church is a very conservative Presbyterian denomination, for some reason, the clerk of our assembly sent out a note to one November Sunday to every church saying, whatever you do, stop at 12 noon and pray for David. And that Sunday, I began to recover, and slowly recovered. Eventually got out of the hospital after numerous adventures. I mean, I got E. coli of the lung. I got a blood clot. I got pneumonia. It just went on and on and on and on. But I remember there's a couple of positive things. I remember arguing with my surgeon, Mr. Shimmy. Well, there's 2 stories regarding him. First of all, he sent me to physio. And when I went to physio, my muscle had atrophied. I couldn't walk. I couldn't do anything. And the physio looked at the note she had from the surgeon and said, oh, that man, I could kill him. I said, why? He said, well, first of all, he wants to put you in a hydro pool. A, we don't have one, and B, it wouldn't do you any good. And then I said, what's the other thing you're mad at? She said, well, he's not letting you home until you can walk. And she says, David, this is going to be really hard. And I was in some kind of machine, and she said, I'd like you to walk towards the door and just keep going if you can. And I walked towards the door in this machine, and I got to the end of the corridor, and she said, how on earth did you manage that? And I said, well, I calculated that it would be 5 Psalm 23s. So I just said Psalm 23 5 times, and I'd made it. And she said, okay, you're one of those. And I said, what do you mean one of those? She said, David, 90% of physio patients, physio is really hard. And 90% we have to go to people and make them do their exercises, check up they're doing. There's 10% that we have to stop them doing things. You're one of the 10%.
Right.
And I remember the other thing that happened was, as I was getting better, I met Mr. Shimmy. He came to see me, of course. And I said, I want to go home by Christmas. He said, not a chance. He says, okay, you're good at arguing. Tell me why you should go home. I said, I need clean air. I don't want to get infections, and I need rest. And he looked at me and he said, you're very clever. Those are the only 3 reasons. So he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. Because you're in a church, he was a Muslim actually, because you're in a church, because your wife has agreed to buy a bed, to put a bed downstairs, because you'll have the support of the church, I'm willing to let you go home, providing, first of all, I give you a trial period this Saturday, and we'll let you go home before Christmas if that works. So they came to pick me up from the hospital. I remember it in December. I remember going out, breathing clean air for the first time in 3 months, fresh air. It was cold. It was like -2, Scotland in winter. And we got home, and it was such a bizarre thing. But I, with the aid of kind of a wheelchair and so on, I got into the house, sat in my seat, and I wondered where my wife and daughter had gone, because I just heard these shouts of delight and so on. And as we got home, this happened, and this is almost unbelievable. First of all, a bunch of flowers from my wife's workmates who weren't Christians, who worked in the social work department, arrived just as we got home. Secondly, a van pulled up with a massive hamper from Marks and Spencer's, which had been ordered by somebody in the United States who I hardly knew, a very wealthy man. I don't think he knew I was ill. I think he just sent us it for Christmas. It was like just a real token. It was like a perfect coming home present, and they brought it in, and there was, champagne and mushrooms and cheese and just everything, chocolates. And, then I went back to the hospital, and I did get out the following week. Anyway, the story that you referenced at the beginning, as I recovered, one of the reasons I got home was I agreed to see a physio at home. And again, the same thing happened. I remember I had to learn to walk again. The first time I was able to climb any stairs was a joyous occasion. The first time I was able to get to my front door, to walk just a couple of yards to the gate, to go down to Brodie Ferry Beach and walk 100 meters. All these things, all these first time things were absolutely wonderful. You don't think about walking, when you do it all the time. But as I recovered, I got an invitation to speak at, I think it was the British Council, who wanted me to go and speak up in Thurso in the far north of Scotland, which was like 250 miles from where I lived. And they wanted me to speak as part of a panel where they were going to have 3 scientists and then 3 religious people. And it was on religion and science and why people don't believe in God and why they do. And it was funny, the British Council thought the state of religion in Britain, it was 2 Muslims and me. And anyway, it was my turn. I was getting near my turn, and it was interesting that they thought the scientists would all be opposed. And I pointed out there were many scientists who believed in God. Anyway, one scientist stood up and he just said this. He said, "I don't believe in God because I've never met anyone who's been healed in answer to prayer." So I stood up and I had my speech and everything, and I screwed it up into a ball and I threw it in the bin and said, "Okay, now you have. And let me tell you my story." And I wasn't going to do that. And I did say it. And there were 2 remarkable things about it. When I told him about my son's Facebook message, he said to me, "That is not fair." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, if you die, that's an answer to prayer. If you live, that's an answer to prayer." He said, "That means that God wins every time." I said, "You've just described Christianity. Well done."
Brilliant.
But what was most moving and beautiful, and that people didn't know, when I got ill, there was another Free Church minister who got ill, who was from Thurso. Now, he was supposed to recover. He had cancer, but he was meant to recover, and I was meant to die. Well, he died, and I lived. I didn't know that his widow was in the audience. But afterwards, she came up to me and she said, "I want to thank you for what you said. I want to thank you especially for what your son said. My husband's time was done. Yours isn't. And you have to carry on doing what you're doing." And it was profoundly moving, and beautiful, actually. So it very much was a defining moment. And maybe one other aspect of it, it was my surgeon, Mr. Shimmy. See, I was quite a famous case because they didn't know what to do with me. They had lots of arguments on staff. He called his staff together and he said, "In 30 years of surgery, I've only seen 2 people whose recovery I can't explain." And then he looked at one of the nurses who came to our church and said, "One of them is your minister." And he said, "I regard it as a miracle." In fact, when I phoned up his wife, we had a Thanksgiving service when I eventually got back to work a few months later. And I phoned up his wife and said, would Mr. Shimmy like to come to the Thanksgiving service? And she said, yes. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. That's made my day. And she said, why? I said, well, your husband saved my life. And she said, that's not what he says. I says, what does he say? He says that God saved her life. And I said, oh, that's terrible. She said, what do you mean that's terrible? I said, I've just had my theology corrected by a Muslim. I said, so...
Oh, that's wonderful. And I'm guessing, so for my context, very different, but I was living in a war zone. I expected to die. People tried to kill me. And it just meant that life was so precious. Every day I wanted to make the most of every opportunity. Now, you coming out of this incredibly close shave, I presume it just sharpened you massively, did it?
Well, yeah. So Mr. Shimmy said something to me before I left. He came and he said, David, in fact, it was quite funny because before I'd gone into surgery right at the beginning, 3 months before, I asked him where he was from and he said, guess, and I'll give you a bottle of wine. And this is before I went into my first surgery. And, I said Kazakhstan. And then he said, no. And the second one, I said Saudi Arabia. And he said, you're very clever. He said, okay, I owe you a bottle. So 3 months later, I'm leaving the hospital, getting ready to leave, and he comes up with a lovely bottle of wine, which was interesting because as a Muslim, he was teetotal, I think. But anyway, he brought me that. And he sat down and he said, you're a very fortunate man. And I said, you mean because of my recovery? He said, no. Because he said, you deal with the most important questions that people ever deal with, and you've been right to the absolute edge. And that was true. But also this was true. When I came out to breathe clean air, to drink a glass of water, to be with your family, all of these things, I think it was months before I stopped consciously thanking God every time I drank some water.
Yeah, get that.
And I still do. I mean, I live 7 floors up, and occasionally I climb the stairs purely and simply because I can. And there was a time when I couldn't.
Yeah.
And that's 2011. So what, we're 13 years later, and I'm very conscious. I mean, there's another thing. I don't really say this a lot to people, but I was lying in the high dependency unit, and there was 2 things I remember. There was a gentleman opposite me. I was conscious, and he had a massive bowl of fruit, and I could have killed him, because he was just, I so desperately wanted to have something to eat or drink, and I couldn't.
Yeah.
And I remember I love reading, love watching films and so on, and I couldn't do any of that. And I remember I'd been preaching through Ephesians, and I think I'd memorized most of it somehow. And so I was just thinking through Ephesians. And it was a very strange thing. It wasn't an audible voice, but it wasn't just a hunch. It was something in between where I was certain that God said to me 2 things. And this doesn't happen to me. I'm not regular. I wouldn't say, oh, God told me this other than through his word. But in this instance, one was that this is a real test of the church, whether it's your church or my church. And by the way, the lovely thing about that was the church continued to grow, so much so that when I went back, there were quite a few people who didn't know who I was, which was lovely. I was the minister, but never mind. And the other thing was a very simple one. I realized I'd been near death. I hadn't realized till then. And what I heard was, you're going to get out of here. And whether it's for 5 months, 5 years, or 50 years, it's not your business, it's mine. But you must teach my word. And that for me was just an absolute. I've never forgotten that, and I never will forget it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thinking of you being thankful walking upstairs and stuff, for me, it was my eyes. So a guy came to my house with a grenade to kill me. He'd written me a letter saying he was going to cut out my eyes. And that was quite a traumatic experience. I had nightmares. I had to change where I lived for a bit. But and vary my routes around town on my motorbike. But it was one of the biggest gifts God's ever given me, because for the first time in my life, I said, thank you, Lord, that I can see. And then you roll that out by extension. In Romans 12 said that therefore in view of God's mercy, the Greek where there's plural, it's mercies. And I say to people, just whenever, be it you're a Scotsman, I'm an Englishman, as Brits, our national pastime is moaning, isn't it? We are so good at complaining, and yet we are so blessed. So whenever I'm tempted towards self-pity, I just go through the mercies, the grace gifts of God in my life. I can see, and I've got freedom to share my faith. I've got access to clean water. shelter. I've got a roof over my head. I can read and write. You know, all those things that we can take for granted in our sort of entitlement culture. And it's a real antidote to the sort of whining negativity that we're surrounded with. And we're meant to be joy bringers, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that I don't think the Brits are particularly negative and all that kind of stuff. And I actually find sometimes the kind of endless cheery optimism sometimes quite depressing. I remember a friend in Edinburgh University, and he just used to do my head in because everything was praise the Lord and wonderful and great and fantastic. And I thought, you don't live in the real world, mate. And then one day he came to see me. He was a Pentecostal friend. And I said, how are you? And he said, oh, miserable. And I said, hallelujah. He said, that's great. I said, what are you miserable about? And he told me that, you know, God had told him he was going to marry this girl and she'd gone and married somebody else and God was a liar. And I said, nah, I think you got it wrong, mate.
Yeah.
I think you misunderstood. But what the reason I'm telling you that story is that we rejoice with those who rejoice. But in reality, joy should be a characteristic of the Christian.
Yeah.
And, you know, that genuine thankfulness. So I remember my mother-in-law, who was brought up on the island of Lewis, telling me that in the 1930s, when they sat and gave thanks, they really did, because they didn't know where their food was coming from. Mm-hmm. And we've got an abundance, and we tend not to appreciate it. So that's what I mean about the water. It's what I mean about, I mean, I'm a Scot. I like, not because I'm Scottish, I suppose, but just, I actually do like malt whiskey, but there's nothing compares with clean water, you know, and then I think of people who don't have clean water. I think of people who can't drink. I think of, you know, so many different things, and there are so many things to be joyful about. But I think that the grasp of the joy is this, that what my son said was correct. If I had died, it would have been dreadful for my family, but also there is a joy even in that, you know. And I think that Christians have this paradox that we should be able to feel pain and others' pain even more than others, and yet underneath are the everlasting arms, and also there's tremendous joy, because no matter what happens, you know, you cannot lose the Lord's love. I went in some very, very dark places spiritually when I was in hospital, really dark. And to have a sense of not knowing God's love is possibly the worst experience that I think you can go through.
Yeah. It makes me think of a friend of mine who was in a internally displaced camp in Burundi, and she saw an old man with his empty bowl praying and in his rags, and she went over and sat next to him, and she said, what's your story, old man? And he told her how he'd walked 6 days to get to that camp in his 80s, having seen his wife and kids hacked to death and his house burnt down. And so literally in front of her there in his rags with that empty bowl, that was all he was in the world. And he turned to her at the end of this horrific story and he said, Madame Missionnaire, I never realized that Jesus was all I needed until Jesus was all I had. Mind blowing. And I guess, you know, we would say, well, what a rich man, because he's not here now. He's in glory. But what an incredible perspective and conclusion to come to. So, I mean, chronologically, we're not following it at all here in this interview, which is fine. But just going back a bit. So, what made you set up Solus?
Okay, I mean, it's all right. You're being very biblical, not going chronologically. You know, that's how the Hebrews did history. So, and I'm a history student. I'd been a young minister in the Scottish Highlands in quite a small church that was about 40, and after about 6 years, I think it grew to about 100. It was wonderful. We had an 18-month period where someone from the world, as they say, was converted every month. And I remember getting a phone call from a minister in Edinburgh called Alec MacDonald, and he said, David, the minister in Dundee is going to resign. We want to appoint someone. We're going to make a redevelopment charge. There's only a handful of people in the congregation. We're thinking about you. And my immediate response was, no, I'm happy here. I've got a young family. I look at one door, there's the sea, another door, there's the mountains, there's a golf course out one side, the congregation's growing, we feel very blessed. But I thought, I've learned never to say no, so I thought we will go down to Dundee, and we went down to Dundee, and we went to this church. I said, I'll go for a prayer meeting, I won't go for the Sunday. And I'll never forget standing with that minister, Alec, and the old elder, and trying to explain at the side of the church that if they wanted to grow the church, they couldn't grow it with free church people or Christians coming. It was going to have to be outreach. Christians wouldn't come to a church like that. Traditional, psalm singing only, a cappella, big building, decaying, just a literal handful, 7 people. So I said, it's going to have to be conversions. And I said, the days of, in my view, and this turned out to be right, the days of a church having the best preacher or anything, which I wasn't going to be anyway, and lots of Christians flocking to them, those days are gone. And I said, look, we want to try and reach out to the skinheads. For example, I just gave that as one group as an example. Well, as I said that, in through a side door walked a skinhead. And I remember him with a big scar on his face. And they looked at me in utter astonishment. And I said to the guy, excuse me, can I help you? He said, yeah, is there some kind of religious meeting here tonight? And I said, yeah, there is. There's a prayer meeting. And I said, out of curiosity, why have you come here? He said, well, I met a girl in the park, and he obviously took a fancy to her. And she had she told that she was going to be here tonight. She had the sense not to come. And he went in and sat down. And then a guy walked in off the street who was a drug addict. And we ended up with about 20 people when they were expecting about 4 or 5. Wow. And I went in, and I remember saying to the minister, who was the interim moderator, as we call it, I'd prepared a traditional service. He said, Dave, go with your instinct. So they used the King James stuff, and I said, no, I'm just going to use the Bible I use, which is the NIV, and I explained about the church in the city and stuff. And my wife had gone and sat beside this skinhead guy, and he told me afterwards, I wasn't going to stay, but your wife sat beside me and spoke to me when I saw the girl wasn't there. He said, I've never heard anything like that in my life, never heard it, anything like that. And then he said, I'm going to the jail tomorrow. I said, are you? I said, what? Do you know how long? He said it'd be 7 or 8 years, which basically meant grievous bodily harm or something like that.
Yeah.
And I just thought, yeah, with St. Peter's, we had no option but to grow the church by outreach. And it seemed impossible. And yet it did grow gradually, slowly, very slowly. But it did grow. And then we got to a point where we grew to about 70 or 80. And I was still very burdened for reaching people who weren't Christians. I remember I did an outreach event in the Dundee Contemporary Arts Centre, which was based on the Da Vinci Code, the film. And I tried lots of different things. And then this man called Gordon Wilson, who was the head of the Scottish National Party, he wasn't at that time, he'd retired, but he'd been the local MP, and he'd been the leader of the Scottish National Party. I went into church one Sunday morning, and it was 11:15. Our people never came on time. There's virtually nobody there. He was there with his wife. I recognized him being interested in politics. I said, Mr. Wilson, good to see you. What brought you here? And he said, your book. I wrote a book called The Dawkins Letters. And he said, couldn't get to any of the book events, so we thought we'd come. And then they just kept coming. And at one point, he held a coming out party, which was hilarious because it was like he was coming out as gay or something, where he invited friends and then introduced me as his minister. And this was all the great and good, and they were shocked. They were genuinely shocked. And he then asked to see me, and he said, David, you got to stop doing this. I said, what? He said, listen, I've been in politics since the 1950s. He said, we planned then for a Scottish government. We planned 100 years ahead. We didn't think it would happen in this time scale. And he said, you've got a far greater message than anything we had. But you're rubbish at getting it out. And he said, I don't mean you personally. He said, I mean the church. He said, how come I've never heard this? I've lived in Scotland all my life. How come I've never heard this? And he said, you have to stop running around like a headless chicken going to every village and town in England, Scotland, whatever, because I was doing a lot of things. And he said, you have to let the mountain come to Muhammad. And I said, well, that's not very good theology, but I hear what you're saying. And he said, why don't you and I start up something which is designed to connect Christianity to contemporary culture.
Right.
So we called it solas because it's a Gallic word, really meaning light. Solas can also mean the solars of the Reformation, of course. It was also an American folk band. It's Spanish for sun. There was lots of, it was deliberately esoteric. And we set it up and it just grew. I mean, you mentioned Andy Bannister. Andy Bannister is now in charge of it. I invited Andy to come and take it on. And it was designed just to use contemporary issues to reach out to people with the gospel. And overall, I think it worked. We did a magazine, which I thought was fabulous. I loved it because it was a coffee table magazine that was really well designed, printed. But my board needed it to be self-funding, and after 2 years, it wasn't. So we stopped it, which was one of the big disappointments for me. But it's growing, it's thriving in some ways. We were for a while. We did think about joining Ravi Zachariah's organization, and I'm glad we didn't. We just felt that wasn't for us anyway. There were various reasons. It was nothing to do with later scandals or anything like that. We didn't know. But yeah, that was part of my ministry. I had this dilemma because my method of evangelism right from the beginning was to throw 10 darts at the board, hoping that 1 or 2 would stick. Laterally, all of them were sticking.
Yeah.
And it just meant I was overwhelmed in terms of work and in terms of not knowing what to do. So I handed Solas over to Andy Bannister. Initially, he was going to come as a deputy, but we decided straight away, just give him the whole thing. So I just gave him the whole organization, really, and withdrew from it. And I was doing a lot of other stuff in terms of media and things like that. And Os Guinness actually said to me, you need to do what you do. Yeah. You can't do the local church and do what you do. And so I came out to Australia to do stuff here. If I'm being 100% honest, this is where I think sometimes if you're just always entirely positive, it discourages people because they think my life's not like that.
Yeah.
Well, I've had a tough 4 years in Australia. What I've done hasn't largely worked, I don't think. So I'm moving back to pastoral ministry in Newcastle in Australia ironically, for a rundown Presbyterian church, but in the middle of an area where there's great opportunity to reach out. And I think evangelism is best done through the local church. I think it's what the Lord put me for, and that's what we're going back to doing.
Hi, folks. I hope 2024 has got off to a good start. I think most of you know this podcast comes out on the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, working in Burundi, which is still annoyingly the hungriest and poorest country in the world. And there are so many positives. I mean, I look back at the last year, see that we've impacted a couple of 100,000 people in a very meaningful way. I've got all these lovely photos of prostitutes that we've helped get out of prostitution, giving them a new skill as tailors. I think of street kids that we've helped get off the streets. I think of microfinance loans that we've given out to poorest of the poor people, mainly widows who have managed to start up businesses and are now thriving, being lifted out of poverty. Mud huts that have been able to knock down and build sort of brick houses with a tin roof and a door that can be locked to actually protect these vulnerable ladies. So many people have come into a relationship with Jesus, come to faith. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. In that context, at the same time, there have been 40% food price rises of basic foodstuffs, and there have been 5 hikes in the last 3 months of fuel, which just adds up to crippling inflation that affects everybody. It's so challenging. So if you want to back us, if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it, you sowing into the work. And that's so you can go do that at greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. We'd love it for you to journey with us. greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. And keep enjoying the podcast. Now let's get back to it. When Os Guinness said, you got to do what you do best, give us highlight reels of where you've engaged with issues and seen a positive outcome.
So my way of doing things is generally, I believe that you can use contemporary issues, but as a starting point to introduce people to Christ without just simply saying at the end of every talk, Jesus is the answer. So I try and stir up people and provoke people. So I remember in West London, I was invited down, I think it was a Baptist church, and they wanted me to do an outreach. And I said to the assistant pastor, you know what I'd like to do? I would like to do a discussion with a gay rights activist on same-sex marriage, because that was old and news in Britain at the time. It hadn't been passed. David Cameron was pushing it and so on. And he basically said, are you crazy? As an outreach. I said, yeah, believe you me, honestly. And I said, look, just run with it. And he said, what if I lose my job? I said, no. I said, just blame the mad Scotsman. I said, you can blame it on me. And I remember it as being one of the just great things I've ever been involved in, because my opponent he was a liberal Democrat, and he was the government architect, if you like. He was the guy who drew up, I think the Tories were in alliance with the Liberal Democrats. He drew up their same-sex marriage bill. And he came with his partner. And basically about half the audience were gay rights activists. It's a very progressive area. It's, I think either it or Brighton would be the gay rights capital of the UK. And so half the audience were gay rights activists. And the other half were either the Baptists or West Indian Pentecostals. So it was some combination.
Yeah.
And there was so much about it. And I remember, for example, one man standing up, really, really angry, saying, how dare you say I'm a sinner? And I thought he was going to come and hit me. And I said to him, hang on a minute. Can you just stay where you are? Please do not move. Let me finish 2 sentences. Then you decide what you're going to do. And I said to him, I am not going to back down from saying you are a sinner, because we all are. But I'm going to qualify it a little bit by saying this. I am 100% certain that I am a worse sinner than you. And his face went white, and he sat down, and I thought, well, what have you done? And then I said, let me explain it. I said, I'm pretty certain you are almost completely ignorant of who God and Jesus is. I'm not. And when I sin, I'm sinning against someone and something that I know. That makes me worse.
Wow.
And I remember my colleague, the guy I was debating with, he said, David, what do you think about homosexuality? I said, that's not fair. He said, what do you mean? I said, because you're asking me a question on a basis that there's no way I can answer that without offending you. And I said, we're talking here about same-sex marriage. And he said, okay. He said, I'll let you answer without offending. And I said, well, okay, let me answer you a question. Were you ever bullied at school for being gay? And he said, yeah. And I said, were people in the church negative towards you? He said, yeah. I said, okay, I'm going to say this to you. Don't misunderstand me. Like I'm saying to the guy before, you'd be very welcome in my church. And then everyone burst into applause, and all the gay rights activists. I said, but hang on a minute. Don't clap too early. I said, on the same condition as everybody else, which is that we're all sinners. We all need salvation by Christ. And I'm not saying you're a particular sinner because you're gay, but I am saying that I believe what Jesus says about marriage is between a man and a woman. Sex outside marriage is wrong, etc. So we had that. And then I remember one of the West Indian Pentecostals saying, it was a brilliant moment. He stood up and he said, I'd like to ask the brothers, what is your only hope? And it was like the Heidelberg Catechism, what is your only hope in life and death? And my colleague actually said this. He said, well, as a Liberal Democrat, I am determined, I hope to bring the tax rate down to £10,000 or the exemption up to 10,000. And I looked at him and I said, are you serious? Man, you need to get a life. And everyone burst out laughing, And then I said, I'm going to use a bit of jargon. So stick with me, guys. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. And at that point, all the West Indian Pentecostals shouted out, hallelujah, amen. And the gay rights people looked away, what's going on here? And then I explained to them, look, this is how, and I talked about how my primary identity was not in sexuality, it was not even the fact I was Scottish or a husband or anything. My identity is that I was a human being, same as everyone else in the room, and that I was in Christ, and that meant everything. And so, that went. But I remember at that particular thing, afterwards, a man came up to me and he said, David, I'm going to tell you something, and it's not a compliment, and I don't want you to take it as a compliment. And I said to him, well, bad news. I said, I'm almost certain I am now going to take it as a compliment. But I said, go ahead, shoot. He said, David, if you'd been my vicar at school, I'd probably still be a Christian. He said, I don't want to be a Christian. I hate Christians. I hate Christianity. And he said, you are a very, very dangerous man because you made it sound attractive and reasonable. So I guess my strength is in public debate and discussion, and also approaching things from a slightly left field approach.
Yeah.
And maybe I do a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. I remember Ranald Macaulay, who was Francis Schaeffer's son-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
He heard me speak in Cambridge, and he invited me back to the house, and he said, and I just took this as an enormous compliment. He just simply said, David, you are the British version of my father-in-law, Francis. I said, don't be ridiculous. I'm nowhere near anything like that. And he said, no. He said, let me qualify it. He said, you're the pub version of him.
Yeah, that's good.
And actually, that was correct. That put me in a gay bar or a pub, or, I've done stuff on the BBC and stuff, but I'll tell you, the hardest questions I've ever been asked have been from 10-year-old kids in Scottish working class housing estates. So it's that level of discussion and engagement and various things. Now, that doesn't always work. It doesn't appeal to everybody. And sometimes churches find it really hard. So I found myself rather bizarrely as a reform guy getting more invitations from charismatic churches than I did from any other. And I used to joke I was the kind of guy who got invited to conferences once. Because I just think out loud and I say what I think, and sometimes Christians struggle with that. I found that non-Christians struggle less with it, bizarrely. Maybe because they expect Christians to be odd.
Yes, I love it the way you've framed that. I've never thought in terms of saying I'm a worse sinner than you, because I actually am in a relationship with Christ and therefore have a revealed standard by which to measure things, which you don't. I loved your interactions with Dawkins. You wrote the book, The Dawkins Letters, and he called you an insult, which you've taken as a badge of honor. And the wee Flea, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's very simple. When Dawkins wrote his book, The God Delusion, I was in Waterstones in Dundee, and I wanted to get it, and I just, terrible, this is awful. I actually told this story in church once, and the manager of Waterstones was there, much to the amusement of my elders, who pointed to, I basically took a coffee in their cafe, read a chapter of the book and put it back, and then did that for the next meal. It cost me way more in cappuccinos than it did to buy it, so I didn't save money, and then I did buy it. I've bought several copies actually since then. And I was so amazed at the book, because it was, as Prospect magazine, although they regarded him as one of the top 3 intellectuals in the world, they said it wasn't just a really dumb book. It was a rehash of Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. Mm-hmm. So I do what I do. I wrote an article online. We were just getting going online then, and it went viral. What happened was I started getting all these letters and emails from atheists. I was so impressed, because my article had been on the Free Church website, and I thought, Free Church people don't read the Free Church website. All these atheists are reading it. But what had happened was, an atheist wrote me and said, I'm really sorry for what they're saying about you. And I said, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he wrote me and said, the Dawkins website, I went on, the editor had put my article there. By the time I got to it, there were 600 responses. And I did a really stupid thing. I started replying to each one of them. And a third were kind of okay. A third were a wee bit hostile, but a third were at the level of, if I'd gone on an Islamic website and ridiculed Muhammad, I wouldn't have got such vitriol. It was extraordinary. I started calling them New Atheist Fundamentalists, NFAs, New Fundamentalist Atheists. And I used to say, your motto is, there is no God and I hate him, which is a wee bit of a terrible emotion, because there is no Loch Ness Monster. I don't hate it, And anyway, I got banned. So Dawkins banned me, because by the time I left, there was 7,000 responses. It was way beyond anything they'd ever had. And everything he did backfired. He got one of his acolytes to write a review of my book, and also Alistair McGrath's and John Lennox's, and I think there was a Catholic writer as well. And she made an enormous mistake, because she wrote a review which was bigger than the actual book, the Dawkins Letters. But she said at the beginning, you'll be surprised that of all the Flea books, that's what they called us, the Fleas, Robertson's is by far the best. So my publisher immediately put it on the cover, which is just brilliant. So we turn everything, you know, at one level. But he called me a flea because he cited the poet W.H. Auden. They're like fleas living off a dog's back. To which my response was, you have no idea what Christian publishing is. I'm not making money out of this. And secondly, I said, you're a fine one to talk. You've sold 2 million books in hardback of a rehash of arguments from the 1930s. Mm-hmm. You know, I said, this is a bit much. So he absolutely refused. He refused to discuss with me. He refused to debate. The Dawkins letters opened up so much for me. People said to me, you must hate Dawkins. I said, you're kidding me. He's given me the opportunity to personally speak to over 30,000 people who wouldn't have come to any of my meetings. So I did a lot of stuff in Borders bookstores, the late lamented Borders, universities, lots of stuff. Some of them very hostile, but all of them brilliant. I think out of maybe several hundred, I think there were 4 that were disastrous. And I just loved that. So as I said, he called me a flea. I got banned. I thought, you're not banning me. I'm going to come back. So I gave myself a pseudonym, and my church was known as the Wee Frees, the Church of Scotland, the Wee Free Church of Scotland. And I thought, I'll take a bet that Dawkins hasn't a clue about Scottish Presbyterian church history and splits. So I called myself the Wee Flea, and I think I lasted another 6 months before he banned me again. But the name stuck. And ever since then, that's what I've been known as, the Wee Flea. So that's, my blog is theweeflea.com. Since then, I wrote a response to Christopher Hitchens. He wrote about God is Not Great, which wasn't about God. It was such a mistitled book. It was all about religions. So I wrote a book. Dinesh D'Souza wrote a response called Why Christianity is Great. I said, no, that's not the response. The response is why Jesus is great. So I wrote a book called Magnificent Obsession. Mm-hmm. I've written a couple of books for Christians on engaging with atheists, but my main thing at the moment is teenagers. So for some reason, as a 61-year-old white guy, I seem to get on better with teenagers than almost any other group. Mm-hmm. And so I've written a book called Ask, which was 52 questions, genuine questions from teenagers. And I've just put out another one called Seek. So I'll give you 3 guesses what the third one's going to be. Yeah. But I just find that the Q&A, the Socratean method, young people love it. And it's so radical compared to what they normally get. Yeah. Because our education system in the UK and in the West, particularly when it was Christian-based, this is so ironic given what the New Atheist said. It was not about telling children what to think. It was about showing them how to think. Yeah. Now our schools and our universities have become centers of indoctrination. In fact, I argue that universities should not call themselves that anymore unless they change, because I say Sydney University, I say you're a monoversity. Don't be ridiculous. What do you mean? I said, I can go to any of your classes and I could tell you what 90% of your students think on any given subject. Why? How's that possible? I'm not a prophet. It's because when I was at university, generally I didn't know how my lecturers voted. Now, you know how your teachers vote. Goodness me, your kindergarten, your nursery teachers. It's just become utterly bizarre. And I think my going into a context and saying to young people, you're free to say what you want and you're free to ask what you want. But I'm not going to mollycoddle you. I'm going to make you think and I'm going to push back against you. And generally, it seems to work. I love it, actually. That's what I love doing more than anything, just speaking to young people. And usually I go to places now and say, look, I'm not even going to give you a talk. What's your question? Go for it. And they do.
Hi folks, I'd love you to check out chooselife.org.uk, and there you can sign up for a weekly vlog that I'll be coming out with through the coming year. Journey with us. And also there you can buy the book if you haven't got it yet, Choose Life, 365 readings for radical disciples. So why don't you join us on that journey, chooselife.org.uk. Now let's get back to the podcast. Brilliant. Well, David, we're running out of time. Any parting words? What you think we need to hear?
Yeah, I would say the thing that for me is I mentioned when I was in hospital, I seem to recall Ephesians, and my wife said that I cited whole passages of the Bible when I was in a coma or something, or the prayer of Ezekiel or something, I can't remember. But I've recently discovered the joys of meditation in the sense of memorizing. So I've just been memorizing Colossians and thinking about it. And for me, I think the simple thing I would say is far too many of us, churches I'm talking about, we think we need to make the Bible relevant. We don't. The Bible is relevant. It's absolutely relevant. The book of Job, for example, I'm just helping with a movie on the book of Job, and it's so relevant to contemporary culture. I think it takes a particular gift to make it irrelevant, but that's a gift that many of us in the church have developed. So but my argument is that we need to know God's word. We need to know Christ better, because it's Christ we are communicating, not our denomination. Not even a set of doctrines. I'm a great believer in doctrines because they're doctrines about Christ. But ultimately, we are going from, so my book on Christ was called Magnificent Obsession. And I never forgot it as a teenager, where it was a BBC Everyman program in the days when the BBC did this, which looked at a group of Mennonite Amish in Montana. It was entitled How to Get to Heaven in Montana. I think you can still get it on YouTube. Very bad quality, but you can still get it. And just long story short, a group of the young Ammonites became born-again believers or whatever. There was a clash in the commune, a culture clash, and it was fascinating to watch it all. But I remember the young Amish leader who had become as he put it, a born-again Christian. The BBC presenter, whose face you never saw, just asked, Jesus Christ, what does he mean to you? And I never forget, his eyes absolutely filled with tears. And he said, Jesus Christ, he is so beautiful. He is my magnificent obsession. And I just thought, yeah, so make Christ central to absolutely everything. That's what I would say to people. And it's interesting, our church in Dundee grew from two sources: people becoming Christians and battered and bruised Christians returning to the faith. And that latter was particularly beautiful, I have to say.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's a number of battered and bruised Christians listening to this right now, and I hope you've been I trust you've been a massive encouragement as you've shared with us. Listen, how can people be in touch with you, or follow you, get your materials? Go for it.
Very simple. Everything is now going to go through the weflea.com. I tried to set up another website and another thing, and it hasn't worked. I mean, there's lots of things I do that don't work. But the weflea.com, I write articles for Christian Today, for Evangelicals Now. I'm trying writing for secular publications. I'm beginning to think that I'm probably going to do something on the weflea.com that will be for members only, because in the world that we live in, stuff that you write can get you into a lot of trouble. I'm sorry that that's the case. I'll still, if you like, try and have the prophetic voice, but so everything comes through that, the weflea.com. People can personally write me at my email, which is theweflea@gmail.com. We is WEEFLEA, all one word, theweflea.com. I've started, COVID forced me to move into YouTube, and we're just about, when I move to Newcastle, we're going to go into TikTok and stuff as well. I'm going to spend 2 days a week doing media outreach, and the idea is to integrate media, the church, and the wider context. Always happy to hear from people. You know, it's funny, I do these I've been doing coffee and Colossians, and tomorrow I'll be doing the last of 124, which is just 5 minutes every day, every weekday, with a cup of coffee, just talking about a verse in Colossians. And it amazes me. There's one woman wrote me, her husband was an Anglican vicar in England. He was dying, and I did coffee and Job, and they sat down every day as he was in his last months, and God's word brought them great comfort. And that's an area I hadn't expected. I just love teaching the Bible to people who are broken and to people who don't yet believe. And you know, as I say, it's not everyone's cup of tea. God has provided the church with a huge variety of different people of different styles. But I guess that's what I want to do more than anything. So if people, they can go YouTube, they can do the quantum. We do a thing called Quantum of the Wee Flea, which is a podcast that looks at news and views for about 30 to 45 minutes every week with a lot of music, culture and so on from a Christian perspective. That's probably the most popular thing that I do. You know, people can take their pick. I produce a lot, and
fantastic.
I would simply say this. I remember sitting down with somebody here, and he said, "Oh, you're from Scotland?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "This was at a conference." He said, "I listened to this guy from Scotland. He's called the Wee Flea." I said, "Well, before you do anything," I said, I am the Wee Flea." And he said, "I don't always agree with everything you say." I said, "Look, I've got a T-shirt that says I am the Wee Flea, and I don't always agree with everything I say." You know, I said, I think out loud, and I learn by being wrong.
Yeah.
You know, so if people want to interact, they are very welcome.
Brilliant. Well, David, I wanted to give you a chance to speak because I know more people will be drawn into following and benefiting from the beautiful, unique way you see things. So, guys, we'll put that in the blurb. Thanks, David Robertson, for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Brilliant. Guys, I hope you've been, it's been thought-provoking, it's been stirring, inspiring, challenging, all those things. If you enjoyed it, please share it with other people. Give us a good review on Spotify, iTunes. If you want to be in touch with me, simongilbert.com. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing, Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Next week, we've got another fantastic guest again, but also very, very different from each other. I love it. In the meantime, God bless you and toodaloo.